Hi, everyone. Welcome back for the final discussion of the Around Nature series. My name is J.D. Tolosik, and I'm the Director of Cultural Programs of the National Academy of Sciences. If you joined us for the last 2 weeks, welcome back. If you are joining us for the first time, I'm glad you're with us. If you'd like to join in the discussion or ask questions, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. This series, Around Nature, looks at the historic Magellan-Elcano expedition through a multidisciplinary socio-botanical lens. Yet, as we heard over the past 2 weeks, our past 2 discussions over the past 2 weeks, there's much to learn from our past to understand the world that we live in today. The conceptual framework for the series was created by our wonderful colleagues at the Cultural Office of the Spanish Embassy, along with artist Juan-Lee Carrion. Juan-Lee will share a few closing remarks at the end of today's discussion, so please stay with us until the end. The mission of cultural programs of the National Academy of Sciences is to explore the intersections of art, science, and culture, and this series is a perfect example of how we strive to do this. You can find more information on CPNAS programs and this series at cpnas.org. And the recording of the entire series will be posted at the CPNAS YouTube channel. Today's Around Nature panel is entitled The Taste of Nature. And to moderate the discussion, I'd like to introduce you to Yadira García. Yadira is a professionally trained natural food chef and certified integrative health coach. She is now leveraging her experience as a community activist, educator, and chef under the platform she created, Happy Healthy Latina. Through this platform, she is helping to address environmental justice through repairing local food systems, nutrition education, and health inequities in New York City, especially in the underrepresented and underserved neighborhoods. Yadira, welcome. Welcome to you, and thank you for leading today's discussion.
There, okay, but trying to guide us through this conversation. I'm so thankful to be here with everybody today. My name is Yadira García, and I am, as JD so thoughtfully mentioned, a chef, educator, and activist working at the intersection of food justice, nutrition, and equity in New York City in our most underserved communities, and really at the forefront of how do we use food technology, policy, culturally relevant nutrition and wellness in our communities to make headway. So I'm really, really thankful to be here with some giants today in our food and in our food system, and who are going to guide us through some fabulous presentations. And then we're going to have a thoughtful conversation that ties the past, the present, which we cannot deny, and where that's going to take us to going in the future. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce our wonderful panelists, and then I'm going to let our first panelist take it away. So today joining us, we have Stefani Bardin. And Stefani explores the influences of corporate culture and industrial food production on our food system and the environment. She works with neuroscientists, biologists, and gastroenterologists to ground her research in the scientific world. These investigations take the form of single and multi-channel videos, immersive and interactive installations, as well as tools for measuring and or mediating these influences. She's currently a member at the New Museum's Cultural Incubator, New Inc. In spring 2019, she was a something in residence at the Interactive Telecommunications Program at NYU, where she also teaches in food and technology, science and design. That's my undergrad alma mater, so I have to give NYU some love. In the spring and summer of 2014, she did a process-based residency with the Lower Manhattan Cultural Council on Governor's Island and was an artist in residence at I-Beam Art and Technology Center from 2010 to 2012. And she is also one of the organizers for NYU's Institute for Public Knowledge, Food, and the City Working Group. So get after it today. Get your notepads out, get your juicy questions, because this is going to be loaded. Next, we have Danielle Nierenberg, who's an American activist, author, and journalist. In 2013, Nirenberg founded co-founded Food Tank, the think tank for food, and currently serves as its president. She founded The Nourishing Planet while working at the World Watch Institute, and Danielle has authored and contributed to several reports and books and written for many publications. She holds an MSc in Agriculture, Food, and Environment from Tufts University and a BA in Environmental Policy from Monmouth College in Illinois. And I got a scholarship to Food Tank a couple of years ago, so it is surreal and wonderful to get to sit in conversation with Danielle today.
Much, and thanks to Yadira. It's really an honor to be here with this amazing panel with amazing women leaders in the food system. As Yadira mentioned, this it really doesn't happen enough, having an all-women expert panel, and so it frankly should happen a lot more. So you all have the power to kind of control that and ask for women leaders in the food system to be talking about these issues a lot more. So again, my name is Danielle Nierenberg. I'm co-founder and president of the research and advocacy organization Food Tank. We're really devoted to telling stories of hope and success in the food system, both internationally and domestically. And Yadira mentioned, you know, the folks on this panel are giants, but I always feel like I'm standing on the shoulders of giants who really paved the way to talk about food, nutrition, the environment, equity, accessibility, affordability in the food system, and a whole other range of issues in really concrete ways that create change. Our job as Food Tank is really to amplify the good work being done by individuals and organizations around the globe so that their projects receive more attention, more research, and ultimately more funding to scale up and out their work and have it replicated by others to build a better food system. We believe in so many ways that our current food system is broken. We have a paradox of hunger and obesity, with more people suffering from the impacts of overweight than those that are currently malnourished. That could dramatically change, however, this year because of COVID-19. Some experts from the United Nations predict that acute hunger could double to 265 million people. At the same time, we create massive amounts of food loss and food waste. Over the last decade, we've seen incredible awareness and education around this issue. But, you know, before COVID, we wasted roughly 1/3 of all the world's food that was produced. That could also rise, again, dramatically this year because of disruptions in trade and lack of infrastructure and proper logistics because of the pandemic. Food waste experts from Refed and Godan predict that food waste in the United States alone could rise from 30% to 40% and probably much more if the longer the pandemic continues. And there is massive inequity and inequality with workers who are now considered essential as farmers, meat processing plant workers, grocery store clerks, restaurant workers, and so many others who were once invisible are now very visible to all of us. They are unfortunately paid low wages, are often afraid to report abuse because of their immigration status or their lack of empowerment. And whether we like it or not, public health and planetary health are really dependent on keeping these workers safe, honoring and respecting them, and again, paying them a living wage so that they can remain healthy and productive and not fear for their lives every day when they go to work. We also believe that the lack of diversity in the food system, whether it's in fields or who gets a seat at the table, is an issue that deserves more attention. Agrobiodiversity, as others on this panel can tell you, is rapidly declining because of destruction of farmland, forests, and grasslands, as well as a focus on ultra-processed foods that are high in sodium, fat, and sugar. Most research institutions over the last 50 years have focused on their investments on breeding and developing starchy staple crops, foods that actually fill us up but do little to nourish us. We need more nutrient-dense crops in the food system. And in some ways, we need to go forward by going back and looking at the foods and practices that many communities have relied on for centuries. Indigenous foods like amaranth or cowpea or some of the millets and sorghums are not only nutritious and resilient to droughts, floods, and other impacts of climate change, but can also be delicious, and more chefs and companies are using them than ever before. But that also needs to be done in a really fair and equitable way that doesn't destroy native food systems and that compensates farmers and producers, especially women, for the ecosystem services they provide that really benefit us all. Not only do we need a rainbow on our plates and in our bowls, but we need more women, youth, communities of color, members of the LGBTQ+ community, and others who have been invisible for so long. They need their seat at the table and their voices need to be heard. Women, for example, make up about 43% of the agricultural labor force worldwide, and in some countries make up to 60 to 70% of all farmers, but they rarely receive the same resources as their male counterparts. Young farmers in the US are unable to access land and healthcare and are burdened with student loan debt. So a lot needs to change to find ways to make sure that these people, these farmers, these food producers, these entrepreneurs get access to the resources that they need. Food Sharing really tries to amplify the doers and thinkers who are working on solving many of these issues. I've had this incredible honor to travel to 70+ countries at this point, interviewing and listening to hundreds and hundreds of farmers and scientists and agronomists and policymakers and journalists and others who are working on these issues, and hearing from them what it will take to improve the food system. We try to tell their stories on Food Tank through our news website that publishes 365 days per year, a weekly newsletter with more than 300,000 subscribers, through our books, including a book that we wrote a few years ago called Nourished Planet, which I think holds a lot of lessons for how we will recover and create a better food system post-COVID. We also have a podcast and a live cast. Since the pandemic began, we've been broadcasting twice a day, every day, with different food system leaders who are talking about this idea of resetting the food system. Food Tank recently published an article in the journal Agriculture and Human Values that calls for recommendations for that resetting of the food system post-COVID-19. We believe that there is not an option to return to the way things were. There's no new normal, and when it comes to how we produce and consume food. We need a total transformation and revolution of the food system, a transformation that combines high and low tech approaches that honor indigenous and traditional knowledge and combines it with emerging technologies like big data and AI. We need to make those that work in food and agriculture visible, as I said before. We need to recognize the role of food as medicine and invest more research dollars into nutrition. And we need to vote with our forks and our votes for the kind of food system we want, whether we live in the United States during a really important election year, or if we live, if we're voting in a local for a local school board or in a local town council, etc. So it's a really important time to be talking about these issues because of COVID and because of climate change, but we should have been thinking about these things before. And there are so many amazing experts around the world, whether they're working in kitchens or fields or laboratories, who have a lot of answers and solutions that can be part of a really robust toolbox. Again, I'm honored to be part of this panel, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from the other panelists. Thank you so much for including me.
Yadira, you're still muted.
Yes, thank you so much, Danielle. I mean, what a powerful, powerful way to begin this session, contextualizing so much of what's happening and so much of the work that we need to do. And we're going to continue to unpack that inside of our Q&A and moderator questions. So I'm going to hand it right over to Simran. So Simran Sethi, she's going to be doing her next presentation. So I'm going to let you unmute yourself, Simran, and share your screen.
Thank you, Yadira. Thanks to everyone. It's an honor to be here. Of course, I wish that we were gathering in person. But I do want to set the backdrop of the pandemic that has killed over 100,000 Americans and resulted in historic job losses, growing rates of hunger, dumped milk, dead animals, and a relentless push by the Trump administration to restrict access to the nation's largest food assistance program. Against that backdrop, I want to give thanks to the essential workers across the board, but especially in our food system, who are overwhelmingly immigrants and people of color. According to data collected by the Food and Environment Reporting Network, as of yesterday, at least 232 meat packing and food processing plants and 21 farms and production facilities have reported cases of COVID-19. And at least 1 meat packing plant and 4 food processing plants are currently closed as a result. At least 20,417 workers have tested positive for COVID, and at least 73 have died. Now, this exploitation isn't new. In describing the transatlantic slave trade that transported between 10 and 12 million enslaved Africans across the Atlantic Ocean to the Americas between the 16th and 19th centuries, Tulane University professor Joseph Roach wrote, "The most revolutionary commodity was human flesh." Slave labor not only produced huge quantities of addictive substances like sugar, coffee, tobacco, and most insidiously sugar and chocolate in combination, it transformed the world economy and financed the Industrial Revolution. So that is the context. That is how we meet this moment. But the pandemic offers us not only a chance to mourn and grieve, but to see these fissures that Danny described in this system that is intended to support and nourish us, and offers us the opportunity to address them. To consider people that Chef Jose Andres characterized on Twitter as those we treat as invisible when the system is working, or I would add, when we perceive the system is working, and only notice when it's not. I come here with that deep gratitude and understanding that food connects us to all living things and to the lineage of who we are and where we come from. So it isn't farmers in fields and workers in factories who bring us our food. It's people like us. It's people who dedicate their lives to creating something that we take into our bodies. They transform nature into culture as what they touch becomes part of us. And this intimacy is astonishing and humbling. I think we often treat our food system as this abstract thing, but it's a dynamic entity made up of these relationships that in this era of globalization have been stretched long and thin. They're relationships that have been transformed and transform us in ways that are unprecedented. Danny references briefly, 1 year ago, the Food and Agriculture Organization released a landmark report on agricultural biodiversity. And what it revealed is that of the roughly 6,000 plant species that are used for food, only 9 account for 2/3 of the world's crop production. So 95% of the world's calories now come from just 30 crops. 1/3 of global fish stocks are overfished, and most of our milk, meat, and eggs comes from just a handful of animal species. Now, this is part of a broader biodiversity challenge that was brought to the fore last May, when the Global Assessment Report on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services revealed that 1 out of 8 of the world's plant and animal species are now at risk of extinction. I just want to sit with that for a second. That is what prompted me to change my life. I was a tenured associate professor. When I learned of the gravity of this situation, I quit that job I couldn't get fired from. I sold my house, I gave away my car, and I embarked on a 5-year journey across 6 continents to better understand the deep origins of our food, to better understand agricultural biodiversity or agrobiodiversity, the foundation of food and agriculture that comes out of the connection between the microbes, the microorganisms, the plants and animals that we eat and drink, all of the inputs that support that development of what ends up on our plate. So it's pollinators, it's the vitality of soils, plus what we call abiotic or non-living factors that impact our ability to grow and gather food. So before we started today, Yadira was talking about growing, urban gardening, but in New York City, for example, gardening that occurs, within apartments and on fire escapes relative to large tracts of land, right? So those kinds of factors, temperature, the way we structure farms, all of that impacts the diversity or the lack thereof of what we end up growing and eating. And if we overlay on top of that socioeconomic and cultural conditions, then the points of degradation become really clear on the level of ecosystems in challenges like deforestation and the ongoing burning of the Amazon, on the level of species in the loss of biodiversity in plants, animals, microbes, and pollinators, and so on, and the loss of biodiversity within species on a genetic level in plant material like seeds. So all of these influences are dynamic and they operate in response to each other, and they're constantly evolving. Right? Agricultural biodiversity shapes and is shaped by every meal that we eat. And when I say we, I mean we in the global sense for all of us. We're all in this together. I cited statistics in the beginning about food workers in the United States, but no country is self-sustaining when it comes to the range of diversity we need to feed each other, right? That we need to sustain our food system at this moment in time. We need each other and we feed each other. I know that I'm talking about loss and it feels counterintuitive to some people against the backdrop of what we might see at Costco or Whole Foods. I know there are empty shelves now, but if we think about this in the broader context, it's like, what are you talking about? We've got a lot of diversity, Simran. I want to look behind that, and I did. I logged many hours at Walmart, which is the #1 grocery in the United States. More than 90% of every container of yogurt, milk, and ice cream is made from milk from a breed, like one cow, right? The breed, a single breed, the Holstein Friesian, which is known as the highest producing dairy animal in the world. That breed originated about 2,000 years ago in northern Holland and northern Germany, that area, right? And they brought that cattle with them to what is now the United States. These origin stories are long. In that same Walmart, I counted 21 kinds of potato chips, right? But that diversity is in flavor. And sometimes we think it's in brand, but if you look there, we see tremendous consolidation as well. Then I headed over to the produce section. 5 types of potatoes, most of them bagged, only identified by color, red, white, yellow, plus Idaho. Potatoes were domesticated 10,000 years ago in the Andes, in southeastern Peru, and in northwestern Bolivia. There are about 5,000 potato varieties worldwide, 3,000 of them found in the Andes alone. And if we think about how these were slowly domesticated, while potatoes are bitter, they contain small amounts of toxins, right? So you can imagine the sophistication in indigenous cultures slowly selecting tubers for cultivation. When sailors returning from Peru to the New World brought those potatoes with them back to Spain and to England around 1570, people were suspicious of them. It took about 100 years until the potato was accepted. And now it is a staple of our diet, right? That is exactly what Danny referenced earlier. There was research that was done on 95% of what the world eats. It is research led by a group of researchers at CIAT and a man named Colin Corey. And what they discovered was diets around the world have expanded in terms of the amount, calories, fat, and protein, but the greatest number of our calories now come from energy-dense foods like wheat and potatoes. In areas facing food insecurity, on the surface, this is a very good thing, right? And agricultural biodiversity within our staples has increased, which is another good thing, and that's the result of foods zooming around the world because of globalization. But overall, the general trend is towards sameness, the same types and the same amounts of wheat, rice, corn, potatoes, and soy. And this is a challenge, not only when it comes to what we put in the ground, but what we consume and how it affects our microbiome, as within, so without. It's the paradoxes that Danny mentioned that I look forward to discussing further with you today. Hunger and obesity, food waste and the need for food, for food security, The global standard diet is changing the biodiversity of nearly every ecosystem, including our own. And that, of course, contributes to the comorbidities that we're seeing as a challenge as it relates to the pandemic and the people who are most vulnerable to it. We are what we eat, and we eat what we are. Agriculture is culture, and we have the chance to reclaim this, seed by seed, plant by plant, and meal by meal. Thank you.
Ooh, so powerful, Simran. So powerful, the layers that we're adding to this. Like, honestly, I feel the emotion and the power in each of these conversations. And it's so important to unpack our food history, to not put things in silos, and to understand, to look at the bigger picture of how it all coalesces together, or how it needs to coalesce together, because it's part of a circle and a wheel. So we're going to move right into Stefani's presentation, wrap this up, because I know we want to get to talking and asking them questions. Stefani, go ahead.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having me. I am beyond honored to be on this panel. I'm going to share my screen. I have a slideshow, so just give me a second to get to that. Okay, I'm also going to close my, stop my video so that you guys can focus on my slides. So I'm going to talk to you today about how I use art, design, and technology in my work and my teaching to respond to food system issues by making what's invisible visible. And as Danny and Simran said so poignantly and eloquently, these issues need to be addressed now more than ever. So I'm going to talk first about my teaching. I teach a class at Parsons called Food and Design. We partner with nonprofits to scale and create content around social impact companies. The first one we did was the James Beard Foundation. We did this in 2018, and we addressed their food waste curriculum for culinary schools. And my students are brilliant, and they came up with a variety of different ways to use art and design to get these messages across. And what you're looking at is a placemat for culinary students and restaurant patrons to trace food pathways and to gamify this process so people really understand where they fit in to all of these systems. The second partnership was the amazing Rethink Food. We partnered with them 2019. It was started by chef Matt Joswiak, who was formerly from the 11 Madison Park group. What they do is they collect leftovers from high-end restaurants to make nourishing meals for the underserved communities. By the way, y'all, I'm gonna breeze through all of these companies. Please spend some time looking at these organizations. My timing does not do them justice. So what they needed help with, and remember this was back in 2019, they're doing unbelievable work in response to COVID, but at the time they needed help with messaging around their mission. So they wanted help with fundraisers and events. And so one of my students created a no waste cookie. And the cookie was made with waste from the restaurant, and it included data about hunger, about food waste, to be imprinted on the cookie through a laser cut design cookie mold that he made. And the goal was no paper waste, and how can food be a connector, but also the container for that information. This year, I had the unbelievable pleasure of working with Brigade. Brigade was founded by Dan Giusti, who is a prince among princes. He does, so basically he left Noma when Noma was the #1 restaurant in the world. He was the head chef. He left Noma to do a rehaul of the public school lunch program. And they've had incredible success, but he asked us to do art and design projects to teach students about Brigade, to help the community understand what's really going on in the lunch program. These are just some examples of the work that my students did. And this was a way to teach the students who's working in their lunchroom, who's feeding them, where does the food go, what is their role in food waste, and how can they think about all of this in the context of their lives, but in the lives of others as well. Here's a game they made to answer questions and then throw the format into a little garbage can that they made. So now I'm gonna dive into my work. I know it's quick. I'm gonna start with this initial project I did. So as an artist who's interested in food, I wanted to know what was in my food, and I went to Gatorade. Don't ask me why, but I wanted to know what this most popular drink was doing on our shelves and what it contained, and I found that it contained mostly corn and all sorts of byproducts that really were not healthy for us and not healthy for the planet. So I partnered with a gastroenterologist, Dr. Braden Kuo up at Harvard. And what I wanted to do is I wanted to look at the impact of processed food versus whole food on the body. What you're looking at on the left is a processed food meal, Gatorade, gummy bears, and Top Ramen. What you're looking at on the right is a less processed version of that meal. So we use this gastroenterology device to basically examine what was happening to our foods as they move through the GI tract. So what you're looking at is an install photo of this project. The shelves on the left are the 60 ingredients of the processed meal, which are all shelf stable for about 1 million years. What you're looking at on the right are the 50 ingredients for the whole food meals. And that's a close-up. And then I'm gonna just quickly show you the video of the pill, and then of the pill moving through the GI tract. So what you're looking at on the left is the processed meal, and what you're looking at on the right is the whole food meal, or less processed, I should say. I'm, as an artist, really interested in taking what is invisible and making it visible. This is just some examples of where this work was exhibited. This was a show at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine here in New York called The Value of Food. And I used the votive holders to speak to the context of where this work was exhibited. Again, using the 60 ingredients on the left and then on the right. This was with the Parks Department at Fresh Kills. I worked with Asaf Tamir to create another installation where we played on the consumer culture, particularly around the landfill at Fresh Kills, and how people were consuming all different kinds of things that became part of this toxic mound in Fresh Kills that they lived on, that they just turned into a park. This is another project I did called Microbes. It's a biosensor that basically lets people very, very rudimentarily see what their air is comprised of. So it's a 3D printed necklace. The goal here was to get people to think about how design could spark a conversation about microbes. Microbes are these invisible things that are so visible in our lives, but we just don't understand how to access them. So here's an example of the necklace. The growth on the left is from chia seeds, the right are radish seeds. What we did was we took a swipe of dust, put it into the biosensor, and very quickly we were able to see how healthy the growth of these little plants were, and we were able to do a very quick reading of what the air quality was based on the growth of these tiny little plants. We also use some wildflower seeds, and the goal behind all of these projects are creating hopefully visually arresting projects to get people to talk about things that may seem out of their reach or may seem beyond what they perceive to be accessible to them. Then I started to get really caught up in the food system and climate change. And my goal was to really figure out ways to address this in a way that people felt they could participate. So I started with this 1950s gumball machine, and the goal was to design a tool that examined or illustrates our anthropogenic, which is basically our imprint on the planet, on our food system. And I brought in Chef Ignacio Matos from Estella Cafe Alto Paradiso in Flora Bar. And I challenged him to make a bite to go into this gumball machine. And I gave him a list of climate change winners, climate change losers. And he had to choose from those ingredients what kind of bite he wanted to make for the gumball. And he and his chef, Sam Lawrence, made these incredibly gorgeous and delicious seaweed, chia seed, and coconut palm sugar bites that went into the gumball capsule, which I'll show you in a second. Inside the gumball capsule were also fortunes. And these fortunes were a way of getting people to understand facts about climate change and show how their behavior can impact food systems and, by extension, the health of the planet. So you would put in your nickel, you would get your gumball, and you would get a fortune that said on this side, the sustainable future you seek is not on Mars, but on Earth, and it contains seaweed. And then on the back, you would get these less inspiring facts about what's going on in the planet right now. I'm just going to show you how it works so you can understand conceptually. This is just a little video. So you put the nickel in, there you go. We got to take this project to the Bauhaus, which is the cradle of design for the 20th century, and got to see really how we as artists and thinkers can really make this information accessible so it's not science to science, that it's really a way to speak to a larger population where people's interests and where they see themselves is different in terms of all different portals. The sad news was that we were going to have these gumball machines at the James Beard Foundation. COVID has changed a lot of that, but I really hope that these gumball machines get to go out into the future. I picked the gumball machine because they're also easy to install all over the place. So we can put them in schools, we can put them in grocery stores, and the idea is to really get people talking, which I know now seems like a very prime moment to really show people that they have agency. And how do we show people agency? Through design, art, and technology. Thank you all so much. I'm going to stop sharing and I'm back.
Okay. Wow. How powerful. And a great way to get right into our questions. And I want to remind you all, I see a couple of questions have come in, but please go ahead and send any questions that you have. I'll try to get to all of them on the end of our moderator questions. And I think this is just such a key time because we are reimagining what our food system can and will look like, especially in a time where we're seeing companies gain historic profits, right? But right now, a lot of people that are suffering and that are in pain are the people that have built the backbone of our food and farming system. So I'm going to go right into our questions. And my first question is going to be for all of our panelists, and I'll let them answer in the order that they presented to keep it kind of cohesive. But this panel is all about looking at the taste of nature and looking at food global economies from the past, present, and future, and how do we use food and technology, alternative food systems, and also look at the loss, which Simran was speaking about quite a bit, of culturally appropriate food practices as a consequence of globalization. So for me as a chef, as an activist, as a farmer, when we're talking about the taste of nature, we have got to go back to talking about the seed, right? The seed. So much like the demand for spice, like clove and nutmeg, drove the first global and commercial route centuries ago, we can argue, like Simran spoke about, that the botanical legacies that we have were created by the transoceanic sea transfers in the Atlantic slave trade between the 16th and 18th century. And it had a similar impact in creating the backbone of our food culture, farming, and plantation economies, or trade routes as we know it, right? Because spices were the first dollar bills, y'all, right? The first things that people were trying to get their hands on. So not only were practices such as saving seeds braided into hair or sewn in clothes, as well as intentionally brought on ship voyages, integral. But it wasn't just the seed, my people, it was the expertise, right? The expertise of those already practiced in growing the crop and also cultivating it that are really the indelible part and piece of our food history and why these crops exist here. They didn't just blow in the wind and happen to pollinate themselves and grow. So some of the plants I'm talking about of African origin grown in early plantation era were okra, black-eyed peas, pigeon peas, millet, sorghum, yams, African oil palm, sorrel, hibiscus, malagueta pepper, tamarind, castor bean, from which the oil was extracted, and rice. Yet with rice, for example, something that's so popular and so well known and such a base for so many cultures and communities, we have some contrasting narratives. We credit European mariners in bringing the grain from Asia, but oral narratives say that the seed dispersal came through African origin, and it can be traced back to the earliest species of rice grown in Brazil, which then shortly appeared in the Carolina colony in 1670. I just really want to contextualize some of our food history, right? That's definitely not what I learned in school or in culinary school or in books or even inside of elite educational institutions. So as a food grower and chef and activist, I find it disheartening and a deep educational disservice when we attribute the origins of food without addressing the ethnic and gendered forms, right, of agricultural knowledge that ensured their survival and success. So I humbly ask, and I know this is more like a sleepover, but from a scholarly perspective and the lens of your particular work, how can we coalesce, or what resources exist to course correct and be more inclusive on the complex and entire historical narrative of our cultural foods, which currently is not adequately supported by discussing seed saving and seed exchange alone? Woo! We loaded off the first question. That was a big one, but we're gonna start heavy. So I'm gonna let Danielle jump back on and share her screen, and we'll all mute and stop ourselves and let her come on.
Great. Yeah, I love getting the first question. It's hard. It's a difficult one to answer. I think the course correction has to be around what we're doing now. We have to have more of these discussions. We have to embrace being uncomfortable. I think what has happened, is that these discussions have been led by a lot of white men in the past, and they haven't brought this contextualization that you mentioned into the conversation. They haven't talked about race and culture and gender and how our food system was built on the backs of slaves and poor people and continues to be. And so I think it's having more of these discussions and making sure that lots of different voices are brought in. And that means being very, very uncomfortable in that space and admitting to bias and admitting to, privilege and admitting to all of the things that many of us are not good at doing. And so I think it's recognizing the indigenous and traditional knowledge that our food system is built on, and honoring that, respecting that, continuing to bring it to the forefront because it's been hidden and invisible, as we've all sort of mentioned in our different presentations. And it's recognizing that, seeds, while so important, are not the only thing that needs to be restored when we're talking about the food system. We need to, soil is perhaps one of our most important inputs, and we've degraded it severely over the last 100 years. And so recognizing that there are all these components of the food system, whether we're talking about inequality or the abuse of natural resources, or how we sort of just talk about these issues, the semantics and the language we use, that all needs to be changed. And, when we're talking about looking ahead, this COVID-19 pandemic is actually creating lots of opportunities for reflection about how we can change things and how we can't go back to the way things were. So I think there's a real opportunity to talk about these things and embrace the uncomfortableness.
Thank you, Danny. That was very, very thoughtful. And, it's about elevating and closing certain gaps that we have, because we're not saying, of course, the educational spaces that we have in institutions, very important, but also recognizing that Indigenous and ancestral history that inherently exists and why we're here today. And a lot of time that doesn't come with degrees or titles, but it has to be recognized and elevated. So I'm gonna go ahead and let Simran answer next.
Thanks, Yadira. You mentioned enslaved people, and I just also want to add to that, Indigenous Americans who are also responsible for building the foundation of what we consider the American food system today, from growing to cultivation to harvesting to cooking to preparation and consuming. To follow up on what Danny said, the Food and Agriculture Organization estimates that 1/3 of all of soils are degraded. And it's such a critical part of this, right? Soil is the earth's skin, and it's not soil singular. Scientists have identified over 70,000 kinds of soils in the United States alone. But I want to go back to sort of the central part of your question, Yadira, which was around seeds. The proprietary seed market is one of the greatest challenges. So in short, if we want to transform this food system, we have to transform how we grow and purchase food. We have to transform the stranglehold that capitalism has on what has manifested now, right? So capitalism, the whole system is engineered, and I say this as someone who has an MBA, the whole system is engineered toward efficiency, right? So it is very efficient to grow out the same kinds of seeds. It is very efficient to grow crops in monoculture. But these things are anathema to food security and to food sovereignty, right? So understanding that the way we grow food compromises our ability to grow food in the future. It actually compromises our ability to sustain food security today. And this is what we need to change. This is what is happening. I don't know if all of you are familiar with this. I actually just wrote a piece about this for Sierra. In addition to like the run on toilet paper and cleaning wipes and food, we're seeing a run on seeds, a huge surge in seed sales. And this is because people are really worried. This is a challenge that, of course, it is historic in its roots, but is showing up today in light of the pandemic. So this is a real opportunity, as Danny said, to reclaim our food system and to understand that we have the power to do this. When I interviewed seed purveyors, one of the greatest concerns they said was that people bought all these seeds and they don't know what to do with them. So a huge component of this is education and empowerment, is helping people understand that we've given away a lot of our power to these multinational corporations, saying, you know how to do this best, right? You know what seeds we need, you know what food we need. This is a drive to the bottom when it comes to cheapness, right? Because we see what we hear over and over again is we need food to be cheaper because people can't afford it. What I argue for is paying people enough to feed themselves well, right? Because what we're seeing now is what that rupture looks like. People are not paid enough. They're being forced to go back to work. They have no choice. A lot of these people who are essential are really not feeling like they have any agency in whether or not they can go back to work. And all these comorbidities that contribute to the vulnerabilities around the pandemic, a lot of that is due to our diet. So all of these things are interconnected. And what we need to do is find a way to treat ourselves better, to ensure that our system supports the people throughout the food chain, not just the CEOs, the very beginnings, the smallholder farmers, and the people who are working in slaughterhouses and in factories, to make sure that we are all nourished from financial compensation all the way to what ends up on our plate.
Yes, and it's really not just about giving communities the food or access to food. It's empowering people to grow their own food, to know where the food came from, to reclaim these practices, to include it in our educational system. Because before supermarkets, before industrial farming, you know, we all had agency and autonomy over growing some of our own food and where it came from. So I'm gonna let Stefani answer the question, because this is going to lead right into the next topic that we're talking about.
And this is actually a perfect for me, because as I'm listening to Simran and Danny talk, I keep thinking about the moments in my class where I get to introduce Monsanto to my students. Most of them have absolutely no idea who Monsanto is, and that the fact that Monsanto is responsible for like most of the food that we eat, and the shock and terror that crosses their faces when they realize, you know, that not only the monopoly they have, but how exploitive they are, what they're doing to the ecosystems, you know, back from the 50s, from the Green Revolution. But it also ties into this notion of storytelling, and how are these stories told, and who is represented. And I think one of the easiest ways to do that, it's so funny, this dog always barks when I start to talk. So the stories really are a place of empowerment for getting the message across, and that's what I find through my students. But I think from a point of diversity, we need to start partnering more with people who are diverse from us in a variety of different ways. One of the things I'd like to do is give a shout out to my girls at Project Inkblot. So here in New York, Project Inkblot is a design for diversity company. I bring them into my classes to workshop, how do we think about race? How do we think about sex? How do we think about all of these things in the ways that we ideate, but not just telling the stories, but how do we act on them? And how do we use the right language? How do we create the right partnerships? And how do we use, for me, even more specifically, systems thinking? So the systems thinking is a less linear way of thinking and provides more points of entry for people to get into the conversation, that we can't make the assumption, and this is also something that happens pedagogically, is that there are many different ways to tell a story. There are many different ways to absorb knowledge, and giving students the most access to narrative will allow them to find their voice, that there isn't just one story that we tell. There's a variety of different stories.
I think that is so, so deeply important, and that is exactly part of the reason why I'm a chef, is because who tells our food stories, who interprets them, you know, very much many times in our culinary perspective, we have a very Eurocentric view of foods. And I'm very interested in telling, you know, our African origins, and talking about our Indian origins, and talking about all of these things that make up the matrix and the richness and the basis of our food system. And so, Stefani, this is going to lead me right into the next question, which is for you, with pieces for some of our other panelists. But you've done so much work on scalable and actionable design outcomes that help discover and respond to ruptures in the food system. And I think that we could say that we are currently experiencing one of the largest global disruptions to our food system that we may have seen since World War I or World War II, where we asked community members to plant victory gardens or food gardens for defense, and rationing stamps and cards were used as a measure not only to ensure there was an even and fair distribution of food and other essential commodities, but also to reduce an enormous pressure on our public food supply system. While I was not alive during those times, history is cyclical, and as a current frontline worker and chef that's working at the intersection of equity and access for underserved communities, I'm seeing firsthand unprecedented demands and needs in food hubs, pantries, and banks, which have skyrocketed overnight along with unemployment. So sadly, the situation is mirrored around the country, yet farms are being asked to destroy millions of pounds of fresh food by the day that they can't sell, and the amount of waste is bewildering on our environment and on our communities. So as a professor of food design and technology and climate change, what scalable solutions do you think we could bolster to pivot or develop?
So before COVID, this was a particularly hard question to address. I talked a lot about climate change in my classes, and in fact, every one of my classes I talk about climate change. I shove it in there no matter what. And I don't want to say that COVID is a good thing, but I think there's a lot of possibility that has come from COVID happening. And I think one of the things is that it's a little bit easier now to teach people who generally know instant gratification and reward, which I will speak of in this country, is a very dominant way of being, that how do we think about how the environment treats us and how we treat the environment. And it's become a lot easier now to do this. In terms of scalability, I try to teach my students that molecular revolutions are the way through all of these things, that these big overarching, very large scale movements don't happen overnight. So it's the tiny things. So your talk about victory gardens is totally spot on. I'm going to give a shout out to some people who I know doing really great things. Some friends of mine over at New Ink, Lily Kwong and Lily Taguri, have started this Freedom Gardens platform. You can check them out on Instagram. It's using design to bring to light these, century-old practices and just trying to get people on this train, which is so important. Space on Ryder Farm up in Brewster, New York, is doing a lot around food sovereignty and victory gardens. And I think one of the things to think about is how the curtain's been pulled back on our food system with COVID, and how we're starting to understand the time and labor that goes into good food, right? Like, so all this talk about sourdough, which is great, it also shows that it takes a frickin' long time to make a loaf of sourdough bread. You gotta feed it, you gotta nurture it, that good ingredients take a really long time to grow and procure. And I think people hopefully are starting to understand the value of the people behind these ingredients. I would say one other thing would be, how do we get these ingredients into the hands of people who prior to this could not have access to them because they were overpriced or inaccessible? One of the things would be getting these ingredients into bodegas. And that would be a really easy way to do that, because we're starting to see how these systems of distribution are failing and we're not getting food, which means that we should be sourcing more locally, and we shouldn't be having Cisco, truck our foods across the country. If you look at the restaurant Olmsted has turned its very Michelin star restaurant into a trading post to sell locally sourced ingredients and locally sourced food. 11 Madison Park, which was also one of the top restaurants in the world, is now a food bank. And I think getting people to see how these small interventions can scale up on a very, very large scale. One of the questions from the audience, I know it's a little early, but I think it's important, said that, the gumball machine is a big leap. You're asking for people to make a big leap between, a gumball machine and climate change. And I agree, but I also have a lot of faith in people understanding small bites of information, pun intended, as a way to move forward, that we can't expect people to change overnight, and that change is incremental, and it's not a binary all or nothing.
Well, and I actually wanted to ask you, you and Simran, in looking at a lot of the information that we glean from is from small scale projects, right? And small scale systems that are used, and we think of how we can use them in other ways. But have you come across any use of mixed use technologies, looking at like aquaponics or hydroponics, things that have existed for a very, very long time that also mitigate a lot of environmental concerns and effort, water use? And I know there's a school of thought, it's like the farmers versus like the farming tech. And I just think that, is there some kind of middle ground or anything that you're aware of in using mixed use systems to bolster? And I wanted to ask both you and Simran this. Go ahead.
This isn't my area of expertise, and 95% of our food is grown in soil. So it's not something that I can really speak to. I would like to address some of your other points, just to make sure that as we talk about victory gardens, that we're remembering, this is something that Nate Kleinman has talked a lot about. These gardens were intended to fill a gap that was created during World War II when Japanese American farmers were forced off their land and put into internment camps. So I think it's really important as we look forward to the future that we think about how we are framing and telling these stories. And also that scalability, because you mentioned that earlier, is one of the challenges that got us here, right? That idea that we need to scale, the roots of that, of course, in the Green Revolution, the intention, of course, to feed people, an incredibly noble goal that Norman Borlaug and so many others had. But then it went off the rails, and we end up with this highly resource intensive system that favors monoculture, that favors, you know, irrigation, that favors the use of a high, extraordinary amount of chemical inputs such as fertilizers, pesticides, herbicides, and the like. And I think sowed the seeds for what we see now with a lot of genetic engineering. So I encourage us as we start to look toward the future to also think about the past and how the push for sort of modern technologies, as it were, is one of our greatest challenges. I talked to a farmer during my work in Punjab, which is the region of India that I'm from. And there's a real thing when it comes to farming all over the world around status. And this idea that we want to be modern. We want to be modern in how we grow food. So all of a sudden the neatly manicured, you know, it looks neat. Monoculture looks extraordinary compared to a much more restorative, resilient agroecological system. Or the convenient food packaged, you know, and put in a microwave seems very high tech if we rewind back to like the 1980s and the 1990s, relative to what we see now, which is actually a return, right? That cycle that you were talking about, to the way we have always grown and harvested food, which is small amounts grown locally to support our local community, and to not only grow food in a way that supports the local environment, but to eat foods that are culturally appropriate. So again,
and seasonally,
the small.
So thank you, Simran, that was awesome. I'm in total agreement. I also want to say that as somebody who teaches technology, I'm not so much of a fan of technology and food. In a way that is progressive. I teach my students a lot about biomimicry and looking to nature, that nature has a lot of the solutions that technology can't handle, and that small scale enterprises are the way to go. I prefer my food personally to be grown in soil. I believe in nutrients from soil. I think to Simran's point about these victory gardens and other kinds of interventions being temporary, I think there's also a misperception around, you know, city gardens and being able to feed people. And there isn't enough green space in the city, in New York, to be able to feed, you know, a lot of people. My colleague at NYU, Carolyn Dimitri, has written a lot about this and has spoken a lot about this, that I think that there's a misperception that urban gardens are a solution. They're not so much a solution as they are a way to teach people how their food is grown and can substitute in really important ways. If you look at the work of Juan Lee, who organized this, and the work he's doing with OSS, that gardens are a really great place to share food and talk about food. But in terms of technology and scalability, I think we have to just be careful how we think about what we're scaling and why. Monsanto is the perfect example. It just, you know, it just went off the rails in a way that's super problematic.
I agree, and we do have to keep an eye on even what's happening here in New York, because we do have the advent of a lot of food tech companies like Arrow Farms, Bowery Farms, who are taking out huge industrial factory spaces and producing millions of pounds of food. So actually, and that was tied into a Green Deal Act with the city, where all of the roofs now have to be retrofitted and allowed for green space to actually speak to creating more food production space and to mitigate environmental efforts. So I actually wanted to that leads me right into my next question, which I wanted to also ask Danny and Simran and yourself, which is there any current policy or legislation on the horizon that we can build upon? Because we're often aware of like communal movements, but it's very important to know about legislation and bills that we can build on. So one that comes to mind for me is the Climate Mobilization Act in the city that was passed in 2019, and it includes a range of measures not only to mitigate the greenhouse gases released from New York City buildings, but also requires solar panels on newly constructed buildings. And I've seen firsthand that it's resulted in additional food growing and production spaces for companies and communities. So maybe, Danny?
I'm gonna hold on that question for a minute and go back to what Stefani was saying about food technology. And
Please.
I think there's often a misconception that all food tech is bad. And while there are no silver bullets in this, I think there are so many amazing ways to, as I mentioned before, to combine high and low tech in really creative ways, to honor the indigenous and traditional knowledge of farmers over centuries and centuries, and combine it with what's been happening, for the last 15 years around cell phones, and, whether it's a flip phone using SMS technology so that farmers can get paid more easily, or how drones are being used to, help predict extreme weather events and help farmers understand, when a locust plague is coming. And so I think if it's done in a fair and equitable way, that we can create food systems that use technology in a way that's not, not exploiting farmers, but helping them do their jobs better. I think that's what we want from all of this. Farmers who have as much information as possible, no matter their size, from small to large, and have the opportunity to really use that technology, and make sure that their privacy is also protected. But Food Chink is part of this Refresh working group, which brings together farmers, everyone from Karen, Washington, from Rise and Root Farm in the Bronx, to big technology firms like Microsoft and Google, who are working on these issues and coming together to, again, have really uncomfortable conversations about the kind of food system that we want moving forward. And I don't think technology should necessarily be villainized. I also don't think that hydroponics, whether I prefer eating my food from, that's grown in soil, that's not the point. I think there are amazing opportunities for food entrepreneurs like Gotham Greens and Arrow Farms and others to provide healthy produce to more communities in cities closer to where those folks live, and do it in a way that's accessible and affordable. So I just caution, villainizing anyone. I know somebody asked in the Q&A to me, am I really against all white men? I'm not. I'm against what has happened in the past, where many white people have been leading these conversations, and the viewpoints of others who look different and tell different stories have not been part of this conversation. So I just want to make sure that during this conversation that we're not maligning any one group, because there are lots of tools to be used. Not all are good, but we need to understand and honor some of the things that are out there. And I don't remember. I'm sorry, I don't remember what your previous question was.
No, and when I think, we have to lead into what organically is calling us in these conversations. I think that's really, really important. I do a lot of work with Karen Washington as well, but then I also do work with Yemi from Oko Farms that uses aquaponics in Brooklyn, and we train teenagers to get their food handler's license and learn to use these technologies, which aquaponics she was using in Nigeria as a food system, and how to be able to get these jobs and compete for these jobs. Because also, if we want to see different faces on the boards of these companies, or engineers are working there, we have to create the pipelines of training, our youth and our adult and our community members, so that we can glean from the past, but also position them for the future. So it's a lot
Absolutely.
Of the crux of my work is that a lot of soil-based farming, there aren't living wages. And while we fight for that right now, I do see food tech making a lot of leaps and bounds in our communities. And the conversation is, how do we play together and break down silos, not one or the other. So I'm very personally invested in having that conversation for communities of color and for women as well, women in tech. So
can I just say one quick thing, just real quick, because I think that Danny's point is super important. It wasn't my intention to villainize, but I think for me, I'm just concerned about people responding out of a place of fear that technology is going to save us. I teach technology in food. I'm interested in the way technology works to lift up food in terms of accessibility and in terms of wages. I just want to make sure that there's also this cautionary tale on the other side, that we don't see technology as our savior, that it has to be a combination of analog and digital, and that we can't forget that there are these ways of combining the two that are absolutely so important. If you look at Biodesign Challenge, it's an organization that I work with that uses citizen science, and a lot of it is technology. These are things that I teach, and they do a really good job of balancing science, nature, and technology in a way that's more equitable. And I think, to Danny's point, you are 100% correct that it has to be about equitability in these conversations, that it is not a binary ever.
Yes, 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 yes. These are my snaps and claps. And I'm gonna let Simran weigh in, and then we're gonna move on to our next question. Told you.
I just want to share a quick story about where the ancient meets the contemporary. I had the great fortune of going to the latest deposit. It was a historic deposit in Svalbard at the Global Seed Vault. And conservationists from Ikarda, Ahmed Amri, Mariana Yazbek, and Ali Shihade are the conservationists who help support the International Center for Agricultural Research in Dry Areas. That gene bank was once housed in Aleppo, Syria, an area that's part of the Fertile Crescent. It's the birthplace of ag, where crops have been sown for 10,000 years. And that staff sent nearly 140,000 seed samples out of Syria as part of their safety duplication process. So you can consider it a rescue mission for seeds before the Civil War reached the northern part of the country. And I'm underscoring this because I've talked a lot about the pandemic, but these kinds of challenges we've seen, that we will see, that we are seeing with climate change, with war, there is so much that threatens our food system that isn't just in this moment. So these are ancient varieties, wild ancestors of wheat and barley and chickpeas and faba beans and lentils. And this is one of the biggest seed collections in the world. Had they not been able to back it up in Svalbard, this super high-tech facility, right? Halfway between Norway and the Arctic Circle, we wouldn't have these seeds. Those seeds would have been lost. So 128 boxes of them were actually retrieved and then replanted in Lebanon, excuse me. Now the facility is between Morocco and Lebanon. And I just want to say, like, that is, I think, yet another example of where high technology can meet all of the work that has been done over millennia. And that's just another way we need to keep moving forward. So thanks.
Oh my God, that was so good, Simran, that I have to bump up another question because it's so related. Because you're giving, so I'm going to cut out one question and come to this. So just as the forest does not contain a monoculture of one species of tree, I think it's what you spoke to specifically speaks to honoring the diversity and strategies our ancestors developed universally, such as intercropping, polycultures to create grains, legumes, root crops, such as cowpeas and groundnuts and sesame seeds, coffee, rice, which were so important to African, Caribbean, Asian, and European cultures. So in speaking in the erosion of globalization of our food system has had on these practices, and at a key time where we're reimagining a lot of sectors, are there any other ways that we can uplift and intentionally incorporate these methodologies like the one you're speaking about into our annual crop planning, farming, food, or educational systems? It's a big one.
Do you want me to go first?
Yeah, you can lead into it and then we'll go to Danielle.
Okay, yeah. You know what, honestly, I think it starts with that last piece that you said, educational systems. You mentioned this earlier, the stories that we have shared today. I grew up in the United States, were never part of the narrative we heard about how the United States was formed, about how food was grown, about where food has come from. All of this stuff that for many people, I mean, we've been working in the trenches of this for a while, but for many people, this has all been obscured, and it is becoming something that we're seeing now maybe for the first time. What is the cost of that meat that ends up on grocery store shelves, as one example, right? But I think it starts with making a concerted, committed effort to re-education of everyone, to helping people to understand not only the roots of our food system and the people behind it, but to revere them, to respect them, to love and care for them. That part of this gets obscured, right? Even when we talk about something like food security, it's like, just make sure people have enough to eat, but it's like, it's sovereignty. It's about taking our power back. It's about restoring a sense of who we are, because we are what we eat and we eat what we are, right? So let's change that diet.
Yes. So Danny, that's gonna go right into you, like from a broad perspective in your work. Sure. to a smaller, incorporating that, but like, what does the future of food sovereignty look like? I mean, now it's on, but when I send you these questions to now, it's even on more shifting sands.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I can reiterate what Simran said so eloquently, that we need better education and awareness. That goes back to the storytelling component that all three of us, or all four of us, have really mentioned. Telling these stories, making sure that they're true and that they get out there, and making sure that food history is a part of the history of this country. One book and one person I'd like to recommend is Farming While Black, which was written by
That book.
right?
I'm obsessed. I make all my teenagers, I use it as a study guide, and I'm like, why aren't schools using this?
That book is such a great way of teaching people how to grow food, how to cook, how to eat. It tells the story of so many of the origins of our food. So it's such an amazing way to sort of learn about the history. Yeah, of course, I love it too. It's covered with a highlighter because I love it so much. I also think that, and Simran alluded to this, that we need more true cost accounting in the food system. We don't understand the true cost of the food that we're producing and consuming. So while it might be cheap to go to a fast food restaurant or go to the bodega where there are no fresh fruits and vegetables available and eat something processed, the long-term consequences of those food choices, and they're not always choices. These are, people who live in communities that are affected by food apartheid. Those are the foods available to them, the cheap foods. But the long-term costs on the environment, on public health, on sort of just, our own sense of well-being that goes beyond sort of, human health, those are all affected. So we need this system of true cost accounting in food to really be implemented. The United Nations Environment Program, the Global Alliance for the Future of Food, Food Tank, we've all been very sort of vocal in pushing that forward. But I think now, because of COVID-19, we have more opportunities than ever. And again, this is a tragic thing that's happening all across the world, but it is also creating a lot of opportunities for us to rethink how we do things.
Yes, and we have touched on so much of what people are asking about here, but let me just drill in. Someone said, in talking about food sovereignty, Danny, hold on one second. Okay, so what insight do you have? So hello, I'm involved in a farm school local procurement work, and it's a hard one to sell to healthcare funders. What insight do you guys have in working with the healthcare industry and uniting them to this mission and acknowledging food as medicine? Are there any opportunities, solutions, silver linings? So are you coalescing at all with the healthcare industry? Do you see them involved?
I have. Last year I spoke at the Florida Blue Foundation's annual conference. So these are all insurance executives who are very interested in the food as medicine way of looking at things. You see, when you see insurance companies wanting to, have their doctors prescribe fruits and vegetables instead of medicine to reduce things like obesity and hypertension, there's a real shift taking place. It's not happening on a big enough level as far as I'm concerned, but that goes back to sort of the nature of how we educate, whether it's insurance executives or our medical health professionals. Nutrition is such a small component of what doctors are taught during medical school. That needs to change. Nutrition needs to be at the forefront. Dr. Robert Graham, who started the first garden at Lenox Hill
I think
Hospital.
he's listening. I think he's
I
on
hope
today.
so. He's one of my favorite people. I mean, you need more doctors who are, he's since become a chef and runs this amazing nonprofit. So, more and more doctors need to be involved in sort of this holistic way of looking at food as the first medicine. And I think there's more interest in that now more than ever.
Yes, thank you.
I want to pipe in a little bit just for a second, because what Danny said is so important. But also I think tantamount to that should also be an examination of the healthcare system in general. Doctors are not given a lot of leeway to think about food. I did a project with a group up at Mount Sinai during this COVID crisis, and my job was tasked with feeding a lot of the frontline workers, and just walking through the hospital, and the vending machines are filled with the worst kind of crap you could imagine. And I think it should not be the healthcare provider's job to make sure that there's healthy food in the hospitals just for the providers, let alone for the patients. So I think that it's a problem that is pervasive on all levels. And I think most of it is because our healthcare workers are overworked. And in a lot of cases, those in more custodial positions are also underpaid and don't have access to the foods that they need. So it's happening on all levels. And I think it's important that the healthcare system be thought of as a partner in this, that it's the food and that it's the healthcare system that also needs to be addressed.
Yes, that has to be roped in as well. So someone asked if Simran, can you relate the history of these agricultural discoveries to the Magellan and Canoe expedition? Did you hear that?
I heard the question, but that's not at all in my research or my realm of,
Okay,
no.
so let's go with another one. Can you ladies talk about a little bit about the relationship between scalability and diversity when it comes to food?
Well, I'll just say again that I think it's anathema. These two things are in tension, and it takes extraordinary effort to bring these things into alignment, because scalability oftentimes is tethered to efficiency, right? So efficiency implies growing the same thing over and over again, and it's led to an increase in sales of hybrid seeds. Hybrid seeds are seeds that you can achieve optimal kinds of qualities for one growing season, but it puts people in a cycle of having to repurchase them every growing season because they won't render true after that. So what I would say is that it's not impossible for these things to exist together, biodiversity and scalability, but this is a refrain that people often like to fall into, I think, right? Like, oh, well, we need all of this food to feed the masses. We have to have it cheaper and we have to grow more. Well, back to what Danny said at the very top of this conversation, and the amount of food waste that we have. These are not perfect, right? But I want us to understand that these particular kinds of refrains came from certain kinds of places, and that includes multinational corporations that have a vested interest in us buying more and more and more and more. And a lot of this cheap and processed food is subsidized. It again goes back to true cost accounting. What is the real cost of this for workers, for the planet, for the communities in which these companies operate? Diversity is about diversity of thought, diversity of communities, diversity of people, right? And diversity of seeds and food. So it's going to take a number of solutions to keep us not just fed, but fed well. And I want to keep coming back to this, to ensuring that what food justice looks like is people having the right to eat the foods they want to eat, people being healthy, and people being paid well enough to make choices that support them and their families. And right now, none of this exists. So please let's make that part of the diversity conversation.
Yes, and someone did ask, what do you each attribute that deep lack of diversity in our food supply to? Is it more the economics? Is it more the taste? Is it more the subsidies?
I wrote a book about this. I can talk about it for a long time. Bread, wine, chocolate, the slow loss of foods we love. But I will cede the floor to my colleagues.
Okay.
I just want to say really quickly that one of the things that I've noticed in my teaching as a quick way to get people to understand these scalabilities is the desire to eat, especially here in New York City, the desire to eat the foods we want when we want to eat them. So why is it that we are eating strawberries in February? And getting the students to understand the amount of resources it goes to grow and ship strawberries to New York City in February, and getting them to understand the importance of eating in season becomes a really great entry point for people to understand their role in this. Like that the exploitive farming practices around berries in California, where these crops take a lot of water, they are killing bees, all of the things that they are doing for this extra pollination in order to provide a fruit that we should not be having access to in the middle of the winter. And I think part of that goes back to education and participation for the younger people who don't really understand how these systems work.
Yes, and some people were asking, where do they start? How do they start now with their journey to food sovereignty? What are good resource or guides that you guys would give? Is it to just start planting on your windowsill? Is it to plug into a local resource? What do you guys recommend?
I mean, it's all of those things. You have to sort of start where you're comfortable at. So if it's growing more during this time, do that. If it's volunteering and doing that safely, if it's reading more books like Leah Penniman's, there are all these ways to get involved. I think it's just this matter of sort of what we've been all saying during this webinar is that what has been invisible for so long because of COVID-19 is now very visible. And we can't forget that. So once this pandemic is, taken care of, once the emergency is over, we cannot go back to sort of, being blind again. And I think that's the most important thing to understand. As you said at the beginning, more people are understanding where their food is coming from, and, because there have been shortages on grocery store shelves. Don't forget what we've been through after this is over. And in some ways it might get worse, in some ways it might get better, but I think there's been a lot more interest in building regional and local food systems that will strengthen, national economies, that will, provide food more easily and make it hopefully more accessible and affordable to lots of people. I think there's a real sort of redefinition of what scale means, as we've been talking about. We think of scaling as scaling up. We need to sort of reframe that to scaling out and replicating and having more businesses and more farmers, not fewer, which has been the trend for the last 60, 70 years. So I just think it's finding out what you're interested in, tapping into organizations, reading books like Simran's, tapping into organizations that speak to you, and getting that information, and realizing that the future, while uncertain, that holds a lot of opportunity because of what we're all going through right now collectively as a planet.
And I think, you and Simran both spoke to this, the huge surge in interest in gardening and in seed buying and seed saving now. But some people had questions about that. They understand that in places like India or Colombia, people can no longer grow their own seeds by law, and they have to buy it from private companies. So I think they're talking a bit about Monsanto and those practices. But they're asking, is this true? And is there any work being done in seed saving in that way to rescue? So have you ladies heard about anything in that respect? It being illegal for people to buy seeds?
I mean, I think farmers who are locked into contracts where they are forced to buy the seeds from certain companies. I don't know how to answer this question because I don't know really what it's alluding to. But I think when farmers in especially developing countries are set up under a system that forces them to buy both seeds and inputs from one company, that's a recipe for disaster, no matter what. But
yeah,
I think
they're saying, how can this be stopped? But I think it's more on a company level, because as a consumer and on small scale farming, we have a lot more choices over seed sovereignty. Let me see if I pull up another question for you guys. So someone else asked, Stephanie, they said the gumball machines, would you consider marketing these or making them available direct to consumer in the future? They look like a great way to disseminate ideas, message, and influence behavior.
Thank you, and thank you for that comment. Yeah, that's the whole goal. The proposal for this project has always been to try to get them into as many places as possible, and especially to areas where education doesn't include these kinds of stories. So yeah, I'd be totally open to that. The idea is to make it free for the people who participate. So yeah, I'm always open to those kinds of collaborations. Yeah.
There was no way to get to like the 70 questions in here. Many people wanted to ask you guys a lot more, and asked if this will be recorded. So I think it will be live and be able to be shared. So I'm going to hand it over to Juan Lee, who's going to close up with us. I want to say thank you. I'm here like sweating because these are such great topics and questions, and the continuation of a much deeper conversation we need to keep having as a community.
Thank you so much, Yadira, for leading us through this very important and inevitably sweet and sour conversation. I'm really moved by so much forward thinking that this panel has brought up to the symposium. I have been listening to you, and I was like here clapping, cheering, like bumping in the table saying, yes, this is what it needs to be said. I really wanted to, like, I wish we could have been in person and like could have like, you know, like express this like urgency that these messages are like just so necessary. I want to really thank Danielle, Simran, and Stefani. Your words are like really very necessary to be heard by as much people as possible. And since I think this emergency, the emergency of our food systems has been revealed even more with this situation, but we cannot, as Danielle said, we can't ignore the fact that these systems were already broken before this crisis. This is not news. This is not like something new. I'm really glad to end this series with this urgent message that you all have been given. Over these 3 weeks, we have learned about the history of microbial globalization. We have laid out ideas about the consequences of the loss of biodiversity, the relationships of the first trip around the world by Magallanes and Elcano, and the contemporary environmental justice situation that we're living today. And I just want to keep the idea that is being beautifully laid out today about like how the destruction of the diversity of our cultures and by instance the food heritage is deeply connected to all these previous ideas, like how everything is like an interconnection of systems, and like food is at the bottom of it, and food and culture is at the bottom of it all. I want to thank you also to the team of the Cultural Office of the Spanish Embassy, Ander Lopez, Ana Fernandez, Sofia Lucini, Vanessa Peña, Alberto Saavedra, and especially to Ernesto Coro, with whom I have been working hand in hand for the past year in the development of Around Nature. Thank you also to the National Academy of Science, to JD Talasek, to Alana Quinn, and also to Moises Ramirez. And most importantly, thanks to all of the attendees for listening and for engaging so profoundly in this panel in particular. Like, I don't know, I think we went over 100 questions and comments. That has been like, I don't know, overwhelming. And I really, I'm really thankful for your participation and for contributing to enrich this conversation. It has been a pleasure to navigate around nature with you all. And I really hope this symposium will spark some of the necessary new thinking and behaviors, new behaviors and new actions that our planet needs, starting locally, as we have been discussing a lot today, and we have been discussing in previous panels as well, to build a stronger, real, and honest global community, not only commercially and economically, as like we have been doing in the past many years, but also ecologically and culturally as a human species. Something that I think that we have to do together, working across disciplines, as like we are all doing, everybody who has participated in this panel is doing. Thank you all. Have a great rest of your day, and please continue to be safe and be compassionate and stay healthy. Thank you very much.